Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Urban Legends video. I thought I would actually make one last entry for this particular series this time around because this was a very late suggestion, but in looking at the information for this particular urban legend, it's very interesting, very fascinating. I never heard of this particular urban legend before, but as a special treat to everybody, I thought I would introduce it to everybody here because some of the information here is, again, so damn fascinating, and I'm sure you'll be able to enjoy it as much as I did when I was looking up some of the information for this urban legend. If you haven't heard of this urban legend, Edward Mordake, I believe that's how his last name is said, Edward Mordake, then again, enjoy the info here. If you have, then you'll know just how interesting this particular urban legend is, and I'll be able to present not only info on this guy, but on some of the other cases related to Edward Mordake, and then it all comes to the culmination of whether this guy was truly real, or whether just through the passage of time he was another urban legend that took on a life of its own and is what we are as of today, describing describing him and his life thereafter. So Edward Mordake, who was this guy? You'll see a picture of him here, and immediately you'll be able to tell what stands out about him, and that is the fact that he has a fully formed second face on the back of his head. And this is very, very particular because other forms of, I believe the term is called parasitic twins, other forms of parasitic twins always have a half deformed face, or have even, if anything, barely a portion of a formed face on the person's regular face. Here, this is the only known exception, that a person has a fully formed second face, and on top of that, this was a face that in some cases was fully independent of the original face. Again, also a notion that goes against normal parasitic twins. And again, the other tales that I'll talk about that are known 100% forms of parasitic twins will contradict some of the info here. So it's up to you at the end to decide whether this guy was truly real, or again, just through the passage of time, he was an urban legend that took on a life of its own. So, Edward Mordrake, who was this guy? Information about him is really, really sparse. For whatever reason, as fantastical as this notion that you have a guy with a face on the back of his head, as fantastical as that idea is, nobody really chronicled him or was able to talk about him or report about him or posted him on on newspapers or on journals at that time. In fact, the only known photograph tied to him is this one. So unfortunately, this is the only one that I can use here with regards to him, but this is the only known photograph, which kind of makes sense because if it's the only known one, it's still the best one possible because it captures both faces at the same time. If it was a picture instead taken from the front, then you couldn't see the back of the face and vice versa. So we still have the best picture to talk about here. He was a guy that so little information is known. It's not even known what family he was tied to. Just the tales go that he was apparently his family was of some royal lineage, is how it's been described, and that whatever this royal lineage was, he was a part of it and was due to be a part of it in terms of, let's say, continuing the royal family thereafter. Even the year that he was born is unknown, but by most accounts, he seems to be somebody that was born sometime in the mid to the later 1800s. That again tends to be the most common time period that's tied to him. And he did not live too long. He died, in fact, at age 23, and I'll explain the reason why. So with this guy, Edward Mordake, it was a short life for him, but the information that's tied to him, it's still pretty farce. Now let's talk about the actual face, the one that's tied to the back of his head. The most commonly associated source of information for him and his back face is from this book. It's called Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, and you'll see a picture of it here. This was a book that was written, I believe, either in 1896 or 1897. It seems to be the only known book I mean, the earliest known book that talks about him. So this is real. Like, this is a real book, and it leads more credence that yes, Edward Mordake was real, because this book was written at a time when, again, major newspapers weren't around in terms of their areas. Certainly anything involving newsletters and anything involving like radio broadcasts, those were still years out at that point. So to have a book like this post information like that, the only basis that we could come to the conclusion is that it was true, that this information was being posted. The other basis that I can come up with is that this book, based on the title that's tied to it, it's more along the lines of a book that is more, let's say, about fantastical stuff. I mean, the title, Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, reminds me instantly of that book that I used to read. It's called Ripley's Believe It or Not, which gives you the information, and it's up to you to decide whether what you're reading based on sources or based on tales provided to the sources is either real or not. And I think that's more along the lines of this book. I could be wrong, I don't know, but I'm just going by the title, Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, and that's what it seems like it is here. Now, this is again the only known book, the only known source with the information, and I've made a copy of this information straight here, and you'll see a picture of it. Be sure, I mean, if you wanted to read everything that's tied to it, by all means go ahead, but I'll highlight the PowerPoints about this second face and what it did. The most curious thing about the second phase is the fact that it was wholly independent of Edward. Again, unlike other parasitic twins, whatever the face reactions were to the original twin, it always equaled it. But in this case, the face itself was wholly independent. And the face has been described as mostly being a male face, but other tales say that it's a female face, and this has apparently been discarded because modern science will say that when it comes to parasitic twins, the standard format seems to be that it's boy-boy twins or it's girl-girl twins and never boy-girl. If anyone has any information that contradicts this, please let me know, but I'm just following the info tied to this particular urban legend, and that's the basis of it, that if anything happens with a parasitic twin and they're born in that manner, the way that they're created, it seems to just be the same sex, the same gender. It's always boy boy, girl girl. So the tales with Edward Mordrake having a, let's say, a female face tied to him, not only that, but a female face that is apparently very beautiful, those are the ones that are more discarded than the tales, as you see the picture of here, of it being a male. Now, the face itself, again, was wholly independent, and what I mean is this: whenever Edward would smile or have a happy face, then this particular face on the back end would look angry or would start crying, and then vice versa. So whenever Edward Mordrake was crying, then this face would start laughing or would start smiling. Not only that, but people reported that anytime they would walk by this face, the eyes tied to it would follow the person. It could be a man, it could be a woman passing by, but the face would have its eyes follow the person to the point that you know that it's looking at you. You could stop, you could move left and right, and the eyes would follow you. How creepy is that, by the way? And then the most interesting thing about this face, and the reason why it's tied to Edward Mordake only living about 23 years old, is because whatever this face was, whatever this twin brother was to Edward, it was not a good twin brother, and here's why. Eventually, Edward would call this face his quote-unquote demon face, and the reason why is because this twin, this parasitic brother, would spout quote-unquote things from hell to him. The way it was described was as follows: the face would move its mouth, and anybody that was near and around the area would only hear either gibberish or hear nothing at all. It would be as if the face's lips were talking, but nothing was coming out. But to Edward, because it was attached to him directly, he could hear everything. And it was so much to the point that at night, all that this brother did, all that this parasitic brother did was, again, quote, things from hell all night long. It was so much so that this poor guy Edward was to the point that he was almost driven insane. He was not liking the fact that day in, day out, night in, night out, this brother, whatever it was telling him the most vile, horrible, disgusting things. That's the only thing it lived for. It was apparently an evil person, and all it would do all day long was just spout these things. Only Edward could hear it, nobody else could hear it. But again, it was driving Edward to the point of insanity, so much so that he begged the doctors around him, those that were in this particular speciality, those that could remove appendages. He would beg them and ask them to please remove the face from the back of its head. But considering again how fully formed this face was and how tied it was to him, doing so would be impossible without risking the life of Edward himself. So it got to the point where finally Edward decided to do something on his own end. And what he did was as follows. He committed suicide, and the most commonly known story tied to his suicide is that he used poison to do so. Whatever his brother was telling him, whatever his brother was doing, it was to the point that Edward could not take it anymore, and at the age of 23, which is the most commonly tied age to his death, then he just point blank committed suicide. And even then, at the point of his suicide, he crafted a letter beforehand saying that whatever happens to him, whatever happens to his body after his death, he wants this face, whatever it was, whatever his brother was, removed even in his burial. He does not want to be buried with this face behind him, lest it quote-unquote continues its dreadful whisperings in my grave, is how he put it. How creepy is that? I mean, this was a guy that to the point of insanity, whatever this brother was telling him, the most vile things possible, the most hellish things possible, he didn't even want it even after death. That's how repulsed he was with his twin brother. Another way that he apparently committed suicide, apparently with other tales, the way that described it, was not by poison, but that he actually took a gun and he put it point blank to the back of his head between the eyes of this face, and then pulled the trigger, killing him as well instantly. But there haven't been too many articles or anything tied to that particular notion. It just seems like it went on a more fantastical route that people were writing as far as that point of death that way. Instead, the most commonly attributed point of death is that he committed suicide. And that's it. That's the tale of Edward Mordrake. Whatever happened to his body, whatever happened to his burial, no one knows, which is curious as well, because again, considering an anomaly such as this, somebody that has a fully formed second back face, you would think that somebody from some scholarly department or somebody from some division of medicine, some high-ranking division of medicine, would ask to ensure that that this very important body would be able to be displayed. But no, nothing tied to him, nothing tied to his body has been found. So it's out there. If it is, it's buried somewhere out there, or it could have been even maybe incinerated and turned into ash, who knows. But with at least for any physical proof of his body thereafter, it's gone. There's nothing tied to it thereafter. Now, the reason I mention all of this with regards to the tale of Edward Mordake is, again, some of it seems fantastical. The idea that you have a person with a fully formed face and a fully formed independent face, it does not go along with the most commonly known real forms of parasitic twins. And I'll describe some of those stories here. A more recent one is a guy by the name of Shang Xue Ping, which you'll see a picture of here. And when I say recent, it was pretty recent. I mean, we're talking like towards the 1980s, that this guy and his particular second face, his parasitic twin, was known. And the way that the story goes with this guy is He was a man that was born in China, and he had this face half formed on the side of his left side of his face. Again, the picture denotes it there. It's kind of hard to see on the picture too, but the faces that are usually associated with parasitic twins, they are not fully independent, and that's the picture that kind of proves it. There's a video out there too on YouTube which you can take a look. It's only 8 seconds long, but it shows how and why I mean that. When he's smiling, this particular mouth that is protruding from his ear area would smile as well, and so when he stops smiling, it would stop smiling as well. And he's the most commonly known, most recent parasitic twin that we know of, at least when it comes to anything involving faces tied to one another. And this quote-unquote throat and the lips of the second face could not move independently, but the mouth did react in tandem to Chang opening his. So again, this is a real life case. This is a real life person. The proof of it comes from video footage, actual video footage we can find on YouTube, and it proves the fact of information that contradicts everything that's tied with this guy Edward Mordake. There's another case that's tied to Edward Mordake, but this one actually has a second fully formed face, but unfortunately the only known photograph is what you see here. And you'll see exactly what I mean. It's the remnants, the skull remains of a two-headed boy of Bengal that was apparently born sometime in 1783. So it's a little ways back. In fact, a full century earlier than Edward Mordake himself. But whoever this two-headed boy was, he had at that time the most fully formed, not independent, but the most fully formed second face that anyone has ever known before Edward Mordake. And the tale of this person, of this boy, was he was a boy born in Bengal. And he had, when he was born, his mother immediately discovered, oh my God, this baby has a second face formed on top of it. In fact, this is also why the tale of Edward Mordake, some have doubted that this guy was real, because whenever parasitic twins tend to be born on another person's face, they are not perfectly tied to the back of the head. Instead, they tend to either be on the very top, as the skull picture proves, or they tend to be, again, morphed on some other side of the person's body, as the previous guy I was talking about, Chang, described. To have Edward Mordake have a fully formed, perfect second face, it just goes more into the fantastical side that I keep talking about earlier. But back to this guy, the two-headed boy. So he was born at that time to his family. His mother, upon the discovery of the second face, was so mortified that she tried to throw the baby into a fire, but the baby was saved. His parents apparently decided, let's not kill him, let's just go ahead and keep him alive. And they actually decided to keep him alive in a form where, if he's born this way, let's at least try to make some money off of him. And so they placed him in a carnival-like show, a show that could not only gather attention to his family, but also get him money, get their family money at the same time. And the way that the story goes is large crowds came to see this two-headed boy, and they would pay good money, and the family was able to make a quote-unquote fair amount of money off of it. And thereafter, anytime the boy was not displayed on any kind of show, the family would just keep him hidden using a large blanket, which kind of makes sense. You would have a large blanket that could easily cover up most of the baby and just leave the face as is. Now, this two-headed boy, unfortunately, he ended up dying rather soon. He died at the age of 4, not from his deformality, but from a snake bite. Whatever the snake bite occurred, it bit him, he died. There was no poison or anti-poison or the anti-venom that could go to save him at the time, so that was it. He was dead. But those that were able to see and visit this boy at the time that he was alive could describe as follows. The second head that sat on top of his own head was not independent, but it could do the same things that the boy was doing. For example, whenever the boy cried or smiled, the face would do the same, although some noted that the face would invariably start doing the opposite. of whatever the boy was doing sometimes too. So again, just like with Edward Mordake, if the boy was crying, then the second head on top would also cry, but then it would smile. So that was also curious too. And on top of that, whenever the boy was feeding off of his mother, then the baby would emulate, the second head on top would emulate trying to feed as well, as if it was also feeding off of the breast of his mother. The eyes and the ears were not developed, as you can see from the top. It's interesting to think that the ears, apparently they were morphed into some place where they were not discernible on the boy's head. The eyes, some places say that were developed but just weren't fully developed, so the second head on top could not see, but it did have some kind of eyes tied to it. And then on top of that, the tongue of it and the jaw was malformed, but they were both able to do certain kind of motions together, which again ties into anytime that the baby on the bottom was feeding, then the baby on top would emulate it and try to feed. Also, another interesting point was when the boy, when the face on the bottom would sleep, this secondary face on top, the other boy, could be observed alert and awake, and the eyes would just quote unquote dart around as if it was just visually just inspecting what's around it, and that's it. So again, this boy unfortunately got bit by a snake and died thereafter, and through a form of almost grave robbing, the body was exhumed, and then eventually it landed into where it's at now. It's apparently at a location, some royal museum. It's called the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons of London, and that's where its current status, the skull that you're seeing here, is located now. So again, these two tales, I presented them because they kind of contradict some of the information with regards to parasitic twins, and the idea that Edward Mordake could have such a parasitic twin as the way he described it, or the way the tales describe it. But it's up to you to decide, do you think that this was real, or do you think, again, it's an urban legend? I'm of the opinion that, well, like with most urban legends, there was something that was kind of real, but I don't know about that picture. I wish there was more info on that picture, because if somebody could have produced like a date to it, or if somebody could have produced an origination from it, that could have created a whole catalyst of information on it being true. I mean, for all intents and purposes, that picture that's been circulating around the internet being tied to Edward Mordake, it could be a fake, it could be just somebody that created a lifelike model, and just it spread from there, because cameras were around that time. But at that time that the Edward would be alive, whenever that picture would have been taken, again somewhere around the late 1800s, 1890s, it would have been a camera that only a particular set of people could have owned because of the expense tied to it. And if he was truly from a royal lineage, that could make sense, that could tie it. So there's a lot of stuff. I think it's muddled. I think he was real, but I think some of the tales tied to him took on a more strange or unreal sense. And so I'm of the opinion that with him, it's kind of like it's him, and he did have a second face, but I'll be hard pressed to see if there was more information that proved that this face was truly independent and could move on its own and so forth. So those are just my thoughts. So what do you guys think? Edward Mordake, is he real? Is he false? Is he urban legend that has just been lost in time? If anyone has any info tied to him, anything else that anybody could describe, please post your comments, share them below. It'd be fascinating to see if anybody does. So, all right, thanks again, everybody. Take care.